The Frostborns Claim. Eowyn Aldrich had always been different, but she never understood why. But when winter came overnight thick, endless, unnatural, she felt it. The air trembled. The snow curled around her in quiet recognition. And at the center of the frozen storm, he waited, silver-eyed, breath curling in the ice-thick air. "You were meant for winter," he murmured. "And winter has come to take you back." Chapter 1. The Unnatural Chill. The change wasn't gradual. It wasn't the slow, creeping cold of a typical November. One moment, Eowyn Aldrich was raking leaves, the crisp autumn air nipping playfully at her cheeks, the scent of wood smoke and decaying foliage filling her lungs. The next, a blast of Arctic wind slammed into her, stealing her breath and sending the meticulously piled leaves scattering like frightened birds. The sky, moments before a cheerful, cloud-dappled blue, had turned a bruised, ominous gray, the color of a wolf's winter coat. Eowyn, at 57, wasn't prone to flights of fancy. She was a woman grounded in the practical, in the tangible. Years of running her small-town bookstore, the Book Nook, had instilled in her a love for stories, yes, but also a healthy skepticism for anything that veered too far from the realm of possibility. Yet this was different. This was a cold that sank deep into your bones, a cold that whispered of something ancient and powerful, something other. She shivered, pulling her worn cardigan tighter around her, her knuckles white against the worn wool. Her breath plumed out in thick, white clouds, obscuring the familiar view of her small, tidy garden, now rapidly being coated in a layer of glistening frost. The roses, stubbornly clinging to their last blooms of the season, were instantly encased in ice, transformed into fragile, glittering sculptures. "What in God's name?" she murmured, her voice barely audible above the rising howl of the wind. The change wasn't confined to her garden. Looking down the street, she saw her neighbors, similarly bewildered, emerging from their homes, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. Cars skidded on the suddenly ice-slicked roads, their horns blaring in panicked bursts. The cheerful chatter of the town, usually a constant hum of activity, was replaced by an unsettling silence, punctuated only by the wind's mournful cry. Eowyn's gaze was drawn to the ancient oak tree at the edge of her property, its branches, moments ago vibrant with autumn hues, now stark and skeletal, coated in a thick layer of rime ice. Beneath it, the air shimmered, distorting the landscape behind it like a heat haze, only this was anything but warm. A figure began to coalesce within the shimmering distortion, growing taller, more solid, with each passing second. Her heart, which had been thudding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, suddenly stilled. A strange calmness settled over her, a sense of inevitability. It was as if some deep, forgotten part of her recognized this phenomenon, recognized him. He stepped out of the swirling snow, a man seemingly sculpted from the very ice and wind that surrounded him. Tall and lean, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of a winter storm, he moved with a predatory grace that belied his imposing size. His hair was the color of freshly fallen snow, catching the faint, diffused light and seeming to glow with an inner luminescence. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were silver, not the dull gray of tarnished metal, but the bright, shimmering silver of a winter moon, and they seemed to pierce through her, seeing not just her outward appearance, but the very essence of her soul. He didn't speak, not at first. He simply stood there, regarding her with an intensity that made her skin prickle, not with fear, but with a strange, unfamiliar anticipation. The wind whipped around them, a swirling vortex of snow and ice, yet she felt strangely protected, as if she stood within the eye of the storm. The scent of him reached her, a crisp, clean scent like pine needles and frozen earth, overlaid with something wilder, something untamed, that stirred a long-dormant yearning within her. It was a scent that spoke of vast, snow-covered landscapes, of howling wolves and ancient forests, of a world far removed from her quiet, predictable life. Finally, he moved, taking a slow, deliberate step towards her. The sound of his boots crunching on the frozen ground was the only sound in the sudden, unnatural stillness. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could feel the faint chill radiating from him, a chill that was strangely comforting. "Oh," and he said, his voice a low rumble that resonated deep within her chest. It was a voice that held the weight of centuries, the whisper of the wind, the crackle of ice. It was a voice that she somehow impossibly knew. She stared at him, her mind reeling. How did he know her name? Who was he? And why did his presence feel so familiar? He tilted his head slightly, his silver eyes studying her with a knowing that sent a shiver down her spine. "You feel it, don't you?" he asked, his voice softer now, a gentle murmur against the backdrop of the howling wind. The call of the winter. The awakening. Eowyn's hands, clenched so tightly they ached, slowly unfurled. She looked down at them, at the faint lines etched into her skin, the subtle tremor that ran through them. She did feel it, a deep, resonant hum vibrating within her very core, a feeling of connection. To the cold, to the snow, to him. A memory, fragmented and indistinct, flickered at the edge of her consciousness. A dream, perhaps, of a vast, frozen landscape, of a woman with hair like spun moonlight, of a pair of silver eyes that promised both danger and belonging. She looked back up at him, her own eyes, a clear, unwavering blue, meeting his. The fear that had gripped her moments ago had dissipated, replaced by a strange, burgeoning sense of hope. A hope that this unnatural winter, this silver-eyed stranger, held the key to unlocking something that had been lost within her for far too long. A feeling that, maybe, her life was about to change forever, a change that began with the very first bite of that shocking, impossible cold. But would that feeling of strange security last, when the truth started to unveil itself, or would she find in his eyes not only belonging, but the same danger that had slumbered in her memories? Chapter 2. Whispers on the Frozen Wind. The silence that followed his question stretched, taut and heavy, punctuated only by the ceaseless whisper of the wind. It wasn't a comforting silence, not the quietude of a peaceful snowfall. This was a silence pregnant with unspoken words, with ancient secrets, with a destiny Eowyn wasn't sure she was ready to face. The awakening? She finally managed, her voice raspy, barely a whisper above the wind's mournful song. It felt alien to her, this speaking of things she didn't understand, of feelings she'd buried beneath layers of practicality and routine. He nodded, his silver eyes never leaving hers. They held a depth of understanding that was both unsettling and strangely reassuring. It was as if he could see the confusion swirling within her, the fear battling with a burgeoning sense of recognition. "You are not like the others," he said, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in the very air around them. "You carry the mark of the Frostborn. The blood of winter flows through your veins." Eowyn blinked, her mind struggling to grasp the meaning of his words. Frostborn? Blood of winter? It sounded like something straight out of the fantasy novels she shelved in her bookstore, not something that could possibly apply to her, a middle-aged woman living a quiet, unremarkable life in a small New England town. I don't understand," she stammered, wrapping her arms around herself, though the gesture did little to ward off the bone-chilling cold. He took another step closer, his presence radiating a strange, compelling warmth that belied the icy aura surrounding him. She could smell the faint, intoxicating scent of pine and frozen earth, a scent that inexplicably calmed the frantic beating of her heart. "You will," he said, his voice softening, a hint of tenderness creeping into its depths. "In time you will understand everything. But for now, know this. You are not alone. And you are in danger." Danger. The word, spoken with such quiet certainty, sent a shiver of apprehension down her spine. It was a word that shattered the fragile sense of calm that had settled over her. "Danger? From what?" she asked, her voice sharper now, tinged with a fear she couldn't quite suppress. He glanced around, his silver eyes scanning the snow-covered landscape, the deserted streets, the darkened windows of the houses. "From those who fear what you are," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. From those who would seek to control your power or destroy it. Eowyn shook her head, a wave of dizziness washing over her. This was too much, too fast. Power? Control? Destruction? It was all too fantastical, too unbelievable. I have no power, she protested, her voice laced with a hint of desperation. I'm just Eowyn. I run a bookstore. I rake leaves. A faint smile touched his lips, a fleeting expression that softened the harsh angles of his face. You are more than you know, Eowyn Aldrich, he said, his voice imbued with a quiet conviction that sent a shiver of something other than fear down her spine. Much more. He reached out, his hand hovering hesitantly over hers. His fingers, long and slender, were encased in a faint, shimmering frost, yet she felt an inexplicable urge to reach out and touch them. Come with me, he said, his voice a low, persuasive murmur. I will show you. I will help you understand. Eowyn hesitated, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Fear warred with curiosity, doubt with a strange, undeniable pull towards this enigmatic stranger. The logical part of her brain screamed at her to run, to retreat back into the familiar safety of her home, to dismiss this whole encounter as some bizarre hallucination brought on by the sudden, unnatural cold. But another part of her, a part she'd long suppressed, a part that yearned for something more, urged her to trust him, to follow him into the unknown. She looked into his eyes, those mesmerizing silver eyes that seemed to hold the secrets of the universe, and saw not malice, not deception, but a deep, unwavering sincerity. And something else, a flicker of loneliness, perhaps, that mirrored her own. The wind howled around them, whipping her hair across her face, stinging her eyes with icy particles. It was a wind that seemed to carry whispers, faint, unintelligible murmurs that spoke of ancient pacts, of forgotten magic, of a destiny she couldn't ignore. Her gaze flicked to her house, the familiar yellow siding now barely visible through the swirling snow. It represented safety, security, the life she had always known. But it also represented a life of quiet desperation, of unfulfilled dreams, of a gnawing emptiness she had never been able to fill. Then she looks at his hand, so close. What to do? Which way? Her head, her heart, her soul, they all seemed in conflict. She took a deep breath, the cold air burning her lungs, and made her decision. The wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The fate, the future, all waited. Chapter 3. The Silver-Eyed Stranger. Her fingers, stiff and numb with cold, trembled as she reached out, slowly closing the distance between her hand and his. The moment her skin brushed against his, a jolt of energy surged through her, a feeling like 1,000 tiny sparks igniting beneath her skin. It wasn't painful, not exactly, but it was intense, overwhelming, stealing her breath and making her heart pound against her ribs like a trapped bird. His hand closed around hers, his grip surprisingly gentle, yet firm, unwavering. His skin, despite the visible frost clinging to it, wasn't cold. It was different. Cool, yes, but with an underlying warmth that radiated through her, chasing away the bone-deep chill that had settled within her. What was that? She gasped, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and wonder. He didn't answer immediately, his silver eyes studying her face, searching for something she couldn't quite decipher. He seemed to be gauging her reaction, assessing her readiness. It is the connection, he finally said, his voice low and resonant, a rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air around them. The bond between us. The recognition of two souls meant to be together. Eowyn's breath hitched in her throat. Souls? Bond? Meant to be together? It was a concept straight out of the romantic fantasies she loved to read, yet here it was, unfolding before her, real and tangible, in the midst of this unnatural winter storm. She wanted to pull her hand away, to retreat from the intensity of his touch, from the overwhelming implications of his words. But she couldn't. His grip, though gentle, held her fast, not physically, but emotionally, as if some invisible force had tethered her to him. Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling, her gaze searching his face, trying to find answers in the enigmatic depths of his silver eyes. He smiled then, a slow, gradual smile that transformed his face, softening its harsh angles and revealing a hint of vulnerability. It was a smile that reached his eyes, making them sparkle like the freshly fallen snow. "My name is Kaelin," he said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to wrap around her like a warm cloak. "Of the clan Frostborn, guardian of the northern wastes. And your protector." Kaelin. The name resonated within her. A chord struck deep within her soul, echoing with a familiarity that defied logic. Clan Frostborn? Guardian of the northern wastes? It sounded like a title, a designation, something more than human. "Protector?" she repeated, her brow furrowing in confusion. "From what? From whom?" His smile faded, replaced by a look of grave concern. "From those who hunt your kind," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "From the shadow blight, who seek to extinguish the light of the Frostborn, to claim your power for their own dark purposes." Eowyn shook her head, her mind reeling. Shadow blight? Hunt? It was all too much, too fantastical, too terrifying. I don't understand any of this," she said, her voice laced with a hint of desperation. "I'm just an ordinary woman. I run a bookstore." He cut her off, his grip tightening slightly on her hand. "You are anything but ordinary, Eowyn," he said, his voice firm, unwavering. "You are a descendant of the ancient Frostborn, a lineage blessed or cursed, depending on one's perspective, with the power to control the very elements of winter." Control the elements? It was absurd, preposterous. Yet, as she looked at him, at the swirling snow that danced around him, at the unnatural cold that had descended upon her town, a flicker of doubt began to creep into her skepticism. "But how?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "How is that possible?" He released her hand, gesturing towards the swirling snow. "The winter is in your blood," he said, his voice resonating with a quiet power. "It is a part of you, as much as your heart, your lungs, your soul. You just need to learn how to awaken it, to control it." He raised his hand, his fingers outstretched, and the swirling snow around them seemed to respond to his silent command. It danced and swirled, forming intricate patterns, delicate sculptures of ice that shimmered in the fading light. Eowyn watched, mesmerized, her breath caught in her throat. It was beautiful, terrifying, and utterly captivating. "I can teach you," he said, his voice softening, a hint of entreaty creeping into its depths. "I can show you how to harness your power, how to protect yourself, how to embrace your destiny." Destiny. The word hung in the air, heavy with implications. It was a word that spoke of choices, of sacrifices, of a path she wasn't sure she was ready to walk. She looked into his eyes, and the choice seemed to consume her. Stay, in a life which began to feel foreign, or walk into this winter storm and unravel the riddles of a past and a future she never conceived. The snow continued its silent dance. Chapter 4. A Touch of Frost. The offer hung between them, shimmering like the ice crystals that danced in the frigid air. Teach her. Show her. Embrace her destiny. It was a proposition both terrifying and exhilarating, a leap of faith into a world she barely understood. Eowyn looked from Kaelin's outstretched hand, still glowing faintly with the residual magic of his snow display, to her own, ordinary, unadorned hand. It trembled slightly, not just from the cold, but from the sheer weight of the decision she was about to make. "I don't know," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper above the wind's howl. Doubt, a familiar companion, gnawed at her, whispering insidious warnings in her ear. This was madness. She was a woman of books and quiet routines, not of magic and mythical creatures. Kaelin's expression didn't change, his silver eyes holding hers with a steady, unwavering gaze. He didn't pressure her, didn't try to persuade her with flowery words or empty promises. He simply waited, patient and understanding, as if he knew the internal battle raging within her. "There is no shame in fear," Yoan, he said, his voice a low, comforting rumble that seemed to soothe the frantic beating of her heart. But fear should not dictate your choices. It should not prevent you from embracing your true self. His words struck a chord within her, resonating with a truth she had long tried to ignore. Fear had always been her constant companion, holding her back from taking risks, from pursuing her dreams, from truly living. She thought of the years she had spent behind the counter of her bookstore, surrounded by the stories of others, living vicariously through the adventures of fictional characters, while her own life remained stagnant. She thought of the regrets that had accumulated over the years, the whispers of what if that haunted her quiet moments. And she thought of the strange, exhilarating feeling that had surged through her when Kaylin had touched her hand, the sense of connection, of belonging, that she had never experienced before. "What if I can't?" she asked, her voice trembling, her gaze searching his face for any sign of doubt, of uncertainty. "What if I'm not strong enough?" A faint smile touched his lips, a fleeting expression that softened the harsh angles of his face. "You are stronger than you know, Yoan," he said, his voice imbued with a quiet conviction that sent a shiver of something other than fear down her spine. "The blood of the Frostborn runs strong within you, and I will be there to guide you, to protect you, every step of the way." His words, spoken with such quiet certainty, were like a lifeline in the swirling storm of her doubts. They offered her not just hope, but a sense of purpose, a feeling that she was meant for something more than the quiet, predictable life she had always known. He reached out again, his hand hovering hesitantly over hers. This time, there was no frost clinging to his skin, just the cool, smooth touch of his flesh. "Trust me," he said, his voice a low, persuasive murmur. "Just trust me." Yoan hesitated for a moment longer, her gaze flickering between his outstretched hand and the swirling snow that surrounded them. The wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her decision. Then, with a deep breath, she reached out and took his hand. The same jolt of energy surged through her, but this time, it was different. It was less intense, less overwhelming, and more welcoming. It felt like coming home, like finding a missing piece of herself she hadn't even realized was gone. His grip tightened around hers, firm and reassuring. A faint, almost imperceptible glow emanated from their joined hands, a subtle shimmer of silver and blue that seemed to mirror the colors of their eyes. "Good," he said, his voice a low, satisfied murmur. "Now let us begin." He turned, still holding her hand, and began to walk towards the ancient oak tree at the edge of her property, the tree that had seemed to mark the boundary between her old life and this new, uncertain future. As they walked, Kaylin began to speak, his voice a low, steady hum that cut through the wind's howl. He spoke of the Frostborn, of their history, their powers, their responsibilities. He spoke of the Shadow Blight, of their relentless hunt for those who carried the blood of winter, of their desire to extinguish the light and plunge the world into eternal darkness. Yoan listened, her mind reeling, trying to absorb the torrent of information he was sharing. It was a lot to take in, a complete upheaval of everything she had ever believed to be true. But with each step she took, with each word he spoke, she felt a growing sense of certainty, a feeling that she was finally on the right path, the path she was always meant to follow. As they reached the oak tree, Kaylin stopped. He turned to face her, his silver eyes gleaming in the fading light. He raised his free hand, his fingers outstretched, and touched her cheek. His touch was light, feather-soft, yet it sent a shiver of sensation through her entire body. A faint wisp of frost appeared where his fingers had brushed her skin, a delicate, intricate pattern that resembled a snowflake. "The mark of the Frostborn," he said, his voice a low, husky murmur. "It is a sign of your power, of your connection to the winter. And it is also a beacon to those who would seek to harm you." Yoan stared at the faint frost pattern on her cheek, her heart pounding in her chest. It was beautiful, terrifying, and utterly real. There was, right there, a proof. The doubts seemed endless, and the path ahead dangerous. But in his touch, there was also the faintest feeling of hope. Chapter 5. echoes of a forgotten past. The frost on her cheek, a delicate tracery of ice crystals, felt strangely warm against her skin. It was a paradox, a contradiction, much like everything else about this new reality she was being thrust into. Kalen's touch lingered for a moment longer, his thumb gently tracing the outline of the frozen snowflake before he finally lowered his hand. "We must go," he said, his voice a low, urgent murmur. "They will be searching for you soon." "Who?" Yoan asked, her voice trembling slightly. "The Shadow Blight?" He nodded, his silver eyes scanning the surrounding landscape, his senses alert for any sign of danger. "They are drawn to the awakening of Frostborn power," he explained, "like moths to a flame. And your awakening was not subtle." He gestured towards the town, now shrouded in a thick blanket of snow, the unnatural winter storm showing no signs of abating. Yoan shivered, pulling her cardigan tighter around her, though the gesture did little to ward off the growing sense of unease that was creeping over her. She had never considered herself to be anything special, anything more than an ordinary woman living an ordinary life. Now, she was being told that she was a target, a prize to be hunted, because of a power she didn't even know she possessed. "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "To a place of safety," Kalen replied. "A place where you can learn to control your powers, to protect yourself. A place where the Shadow Blight cannot reach you." He turned and began to walk away from the oak tree, towards the woods that bordered her property, his long strides eating up the distance with an effortless grace. Yoan hesitated for a moment, her gaze lingering on her house, now barely visible through the swirling snow. It represented safety, familiarity, the life she had always known. But it also represented a life of quiet desperation, of unfulfilled dreams, of a gnawing emptiness she had never been able to fill. And now it represented danger. With a deep breath, she turned and followed Kalen into the woods, the snow crunching beneath her boots, the wind whipping her hair across her face. As she stepped beneath the shelter of the trees, the wind's howl lessened, replaced by a hushed stillness that was both eerie and comforting. The woods were dark, the thick canopy of snow-laden branches blocking out most of the fading light. But Kalen moved with a confidence that suggested he knew these woods intimately, navigating the winding paths with an ease that belied the treacherous terrain. As they walked, Yoan began to notice things she hadn't noticed before. The way the snow seemed to sparkle with an inner luminescence, the faint, ethereal glow that emanated from the frost-covered trees, the strange, almost musical sound of the wind whispering through the branches. It was as if the woods themselves were alive, sentient, aware of their presence. And somehow, she felt connected to them. A faint, almost imperceptible hum vibrated within her, resonating with the energy of the forest, of the winter, of Kalen. How did you find me?" she asked, breaking the silence, her voice echoing strangely in the stillness of the woods. Kalen glanced back at her, his silver eyes gleaming in the dim light. "I have been searching for you for a long time, Owen," he said, his voice a low, resonant murmur. "The Frostborn are few and scattered, but we are connected, bound by a shared heritage, by a shared destiny." "Destiny," she repeated, the word feeling heavy on her tongue. "You keep using that word. But what is my destiny?" He stopped walking, turning to face her fully, his expression serious, his silver eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "Your destiny is to embrace your power," he said, his voice firm, unwavering. "To learn to control it, to wield it, to protect yourself and others from the Shadow Blight, to help restore balance to the world." Restore balance? It sounded like a monumental task, an impossible burden for one woman to carry. I don't know if I can do that," she said, her voice trembling, her gaze dropping to the snow-covered ground. He reached out and gently lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You can, Yoan," he said, his voice soft, reassuring. "I know you can. You have the strength, the courage, the resilience. You just need to believe in yourself." His words, spoken with such quiet conviction, sent a surge of warmth through her, chasing away some of the doubt and fear that had been swirling within her. As they continued their journey deeper into the woods, fragments of memories, long forgotten, began to surface in Eowyn's mind. Dreams, she had always thought they were, of snow-covered landscapes, of ancient rituals, of a woman with hair like spun moonlight and eyes like the winter sky. A woman who looked remarkably like her. She felt a past that was hers and yet foreign. The echoes of a life, a world, a power, all within her reach, but she didn't know how to catch them. The forest was ancient, and as they moved, it felt like it whispered secrets, old and powerful. What would be unveiled? And when? Chapter 6. The Winter's Embrace. The deeper they ventured into the woods, the more the familiar landscape transformed. The trees grew taller, their branches thicker, their forms twisted and gnarled by centuries of wind and snow. The air grew colder, the silence deeper, punctuated only by the occasional snap of a twig underfoot or the distant hoot of an owl. Eowyn shivered, wrapping her arms around herself, her breath pluming out in thick, white clouds. The cold was no longer just an external force, it was seeping into her bones, settling deep within her, a chilling embrace that was both unsettling and strangely familiar. "We're close," Kaelin said, his voice a low murmur that barely disturbed the stillness of the forest. He had been silent for a long time, guiding her through the winding paths with an unwavering focus, his senses alert for any sign of danger. Eowyn nodded, her gaze scanning the surrounding trees, trying to pierce the veil of darkness that surrounded them. She could feel a growing sense of anticipation, a tingling sensation that ran through her veins, as if she were approaching something significant. Suddenly, Kaelin stopped. He held up a hand, signaling her to halt. He stood perfectly still, his head tilted slightly, his silver eyes focused on a point just ahead of them. "What is it?" Eowyn whispered, her voice trembling slightly. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze remaining fixed on the spot ahead. Then, he slowly lowered his hand, a faint smile touching his lips. "We're here," he said, his voice soft, almost reverent. Eowyn followed his gaze, her eyes widening in disbelief. Before them, nestled within a small clearing, stood a cabin. It wasn't a grand structure, not a castle or a fortress, but a small, humble dwelling built of rough-hewn logs, its roof covered in a thick layer of snow. Smoke curled lazily from its chimney, a beacon of warmth and light in the otherwise dark and forbidding forest. But it wasn't the cabin itself that took her breath away. It was the feeling that emanated from it. A feeling of peace, of sanctuary, of home. It was a feeling that resonated deep within her soul, a feeling she had been searching for her entire life. This is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Kaelin nodded, his silver eyes gleaming in the dim light. "This is where you will be safe," he said. "This is where you will learn to control your powers. This is your sanctuary." He started walking towards the cabin, and Eowyn followed, her heart pounding in her chest. As they approached, the door to the cabin creaked open, revealing a warm, inviting glow that spilled out into the snowy clearing. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, a woman, tall and slender, with long, flowing hair the color of raven's wings. Her eyes, though not silver like Kaelin's, held the same intensity, the same knowing, the same power. "Kaelin," she said, her voice a soft, melodic chime that seemed to soothe the frayed edges of Eowyn's nerves. "You have returned. And you have brought the Frostborn." Her gaze shifted to Eowyn, her eyes widening slightly in recognition. A faint smile touched her lips, a welcoming expression that eased some of the tension that had been building within Eowyn. "Welcome, Eowyn Aldrich," she said, her voice warm and inviting. "I am Lyra, and I have been expecting you." Expecting her? How was that possible? Eowyn had never met this woman before, had never even heard of her. Yet, there was a familiarity in her eyes, a sense of connection that defied logic. Kaelin stepped aside, gesturing for Eowyn to enter the cabin. She hesitated for a moment, her gaze flickering between Lyra and Kaelin, her mind still struggling to grasp the reality of her situation. "It's all right," Kalen said, his voice soft, reassuring. You're safe here. You can trust Lyra.
Trust.
It was a word that had become increasingly important to Eowyn in the past few hours. A word that held the key to her survival, to her future. With a deep breath, she stepped across the threshold and into the cabin. The warmth enveloped her instantly, chasing away the bone-chilling cold that had settled within her. The air was filled with the scent of wood smoke and pine needles, a comforting aroma that instantly calmed her frayed nerves. The cabin was small, but cozy, its interior lit by the warm, flickering glow of a fire that crackled merrily in a stone hearth. Furs and blankets were draped over simple wooden furniture, creating an atmosphere of rustic charm and home. A home she had unconsciously sought, always. Lyra closed the door behind her, shutting out the cold and the darkness, and turned to face Eowyn, her eyes filled with a warmth and understanding that melted away the last vestiges of Eowyn's fear. The fire crackled, and, outside, the wind seemed to whisper secrets to a cabin that would now shield its own. Chapter 7. Bound by Ice and Blood. Lyra gestured towards a worn armchair positioned near the hearth, inviting Eowyn to sit. The firelight danced across Lyra's features, highlighting the sharp angles of her cheekbones and the subtle lines etched around her eyes, lines that spoke of wisdom and experience, perhaps even hardship. You must be exhausted, Lyra said, her voice soft and soothing, like the gentle crackling of the fire. And cold. I've prepared some tea. It will warm you. Eowyn sank gratefully into the armchair, the soft furs enveloping her like a warm embrace. She hadn't realized how truly tired she was, both physically and emotionally, until this moment. The events of the past few hours had been a whirlwind, a chaotic storm that had uprooted her from her familiar life and thrust her into a world she barely understood. Lyra moved with a graceful efficiency, pouring steaming tea from a cast iron kettle hanging over the fire into 2 earthenware mugs. The tea was fragrant, smelling of herbs and spices Eowyn couldn't quite identify, a comforting aroma that filled the small cabin. Kalen remained standing near the door, his presence a silent, reassuring sentinel, his silver eyes constantly scanning the room, alert for any sign of danger, even within this sanctuary. Lyra handed Eowyn a mug, their fingers brushing briefly. Lyra's skin was cool, but not unnaturally so, and the contact sent a faint tingle of energy through Eowyn, a subtle reminder of the power that flowed within her, the power she was only just beginning to understand. Thank you, Eowyn murmured, taking a tentative sip of the tea. It was warm and soothing, spreading a comforting heat through her chilled body. Kalen has told me much about you, Lyra said, settling into a chair opposite Eowyn, her gaze studying her with a gentle intensity. About your awakening, about the unnatural winter that has descended upon your town. Eowyn nodded, her gaze dropping to the swirling steam rising from her mug. It's a lot to take in, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. I still don't understand how any of this is possible. The world is full of things that defy explanation, Eowyn, Lyra said, her voice soft, yet firm. Things that science cannot quantify, that logic cannot comprehend. But that does not make them any less real. She reached out and gently took Eowyn's hand, her touch sending another faint tingle of energy through her. You are a descendant of the Frostborn, she said, her voice resonating with a quiet power. A lineage blessed or cursed, depending on one's perspective, with the ability to control the very elements of winter. It is in your blood, in your bones, in your very soul. Eowyn looked at her hand, clasped within Lyra's, and then at her own reflection in the polished surface of the tea in her mug. She saw the faint lines etched into her skin, the subtle tremor that ran through her, the fear that still flickered in her eyes. But she also saw something else. A flicker of recognition, of acceptance. Kalen said I was in danger, she said, her voice stronger now, her gaze meeting Lyra's. From the shadow blight. Lyra nodded, her expression growing serious. The shadow blight are a relentless enemy, she explained. They hunt those who carry the blood of winter, seeking to extinguish our light, to claim our power for their own dark purposes. They have been hunting us for centuries.
But why?
Eowyn asked. Why do they want our power? Because they crave control, Kaelin interjected, his voice a low rumble from across the room. They seek to dominate, to subjugate, to plunge the world into eternal darkness. And the Frostborn are the only ones who can stand in their way. His words sent a shiver down Eowyn's spine. The weight of responsibility, of the destiny she was being asked to embrace, felt heavy, almost unbearable. You are bound to Kaelin, now, Lyra said, her gaze shifting between Eowyn and Kaelin.
By ice and by blood.
The touch you shared, it was not merely a gesture of comfort. It was a binding, a joining of two souls, meant to protect you, to strengthen you. Eowyn looked at Kaelin, her heart pounding in her chest. His silver eyes met hers, holding a depth of emotion she couldn't quite decipher. Tenderness, yes, but also something else. Something deeper, something ancient. A soul bond? She whispered, the words feeling foreign on her tongue, yet strangely familiar. Kaelin nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. It is a bond that cannot be broken, he said, his voice a low, resonant murmur. A bond that will protect you, guide you, empower you. A bond of love.
Love.
The word hung in the air, heavy with implications. It was a word that spoke of commitment, of sacrifice, of a connection that transcended the physical realm. It was a word that both terrified and exhilarated her. The fire reflected in the window. Outside, a branch snapped. How long could this peace hold? Chapter 8. The Hunter's Shadow. The snap of the branch, sharp and distinct in the otherwise silent night, sent a jolt of adrenaline through Eowyn. Her hand instinctively flew to her chest, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Kaelin, who had been quietly explaining the intricacies of the soul bond, instantly went rigid, his senses alert, his silver eyes scanning the darkness beyond the cabin windows. Lyra, too, reacted, her calm demeanor replaced by a watchful intensity. She rose from her chair, her movements fluid and graceful, and moved towards the hearth, where a collection of weapons hung discreetly concealed amongst the cooking implements. What is it? Eowyn whispered, her voice trembling slightly. I don't know, Kaelin replied, his voice a low, tense murmur. But something is out there. He moved towards the door, his hand resting on the hilt of a long, slender blade sheathed at his side. The blade, Eowyn noticed, was made of a shimmering, translucent material that resembled ice, yet seemed to possess a strength and sharpness that defied its fragile appearance. Eowyn's gaze darted nervously around the cabin, the cozy sanctuary suddenly feeling vulnerable, exposed. The fire, which had moments ago provided warmth and comfort, now seemed to cast flickering shadows that danced menacingly on the walls, playing tricks on her eyes. Lyra handed Kaelin a bow and a quiver of arrows, the arrows tipped with the same shimmering, ice-like material as his blade. Be careful, she said, her voice low and urgent. We don't know what we're dealing with. Kaelin nodded, his expression grim. He exchanged a quick glance with Eowyn, his silver eyes conveying a silent message of reassurance, before he slowly, carefully, unlatched the door. The moment the door creaked open, a blast of frigid air swept into the cabin, carrying with it the scent of snow and pine and something else. Something acrid, something unsettling. Eowyn shivered, wrapping her arms around herself, her senses on high alert. The silence outside was broken only by the whisper of the wind through the trees, a sound that now seemed to carry a menacing undertone. Kaelin stepped out into the snowy clearing, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes scanning the darkness, his bow held at the ready. Eowyn, her heart pounding in her chest, followed him to the doorway, peering out into the night, her senses straining to detect any sign of movement, any hint of danger. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the faint circle of light cast by the open doorway. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, clad in dark, heavy clothing that blended seamlessly with the surrounding darkness. His face was obscured by a deep cowl, but Eowyn could make out the glint of his eyes, cold and hard, like chips of obsidian. Kalen Frostborn, the man said, his voice a low, guttural growl that sent a shiver of apprehension down Eowyn's spine. I have been searching for you. Kalen didn't reply, his gaze fixed on the man, his body tense, ready to strike. And you have brought a guest, the man continued, his gaze shifting to Eowyn, his eyes narrowing slightly. A Frostborn. How interesting. Eowyn felt a surge of fear, a primal instinct to flee, to hide, to escape the menacing gaze of this hunter. Who are you? Kalen demanded, his voice cold and hard, his grip tightening on his bow. The man chuckled, a low, humorless sound that echoed through the clearing. My name is irrelevant, he said. What matters is that I am here to collect. He raised his hand, and Eowyn saw that he was holding a weapon, a long, curved blade that gleamed wickedly in the faint light. The blade, unlike Kalen's, was dark, almost black, and it seemed to radiate an aura of malice. She is under my protection, Kalen said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. You will not touch her. The man laughed again, a sound that sent chills down Eowyn's spine. Your protection means nothing, he said. The shadow blight will not be denied. She will be ours. He lunged forward, his movements surprisingly fast for a man of his size, his blade aimed at Kalen. Kalen reacted instantly, drawing his bow and firing an arrow in a single, fluid motion. The arrow whistled through the air, a streak of shimmering light, and struck the man's shoulder. But instead of piercing his flesh, the arrow shattered against his armor, the ice like fragments scattering harmlessly on the ground. The man didn't even flinch. He simply grinned, a cruel, predatory expression that revealed sharp, pointed teeth. Ice will not harm me, Frostborn, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. I am something else. Something else. The hunter, the blade. All seemed unnatural. Kalen, however, seemed to have anticipated this, and before the hunter could take another step, Lyra appeared. The clash was about to begin, and in the middle was Eowyn, unable to do anything but hope and watch. Chapter 9. Beneath a Frozen Moon. Lyra emerged from the cabin with the swiftness of a striking viper, a whirlwind of motion and deadly intent. In her hands, she wielded two short, curved swords, their edges gleaming with an unnatural sharpness, reflecting the faint moonlight that filtered through the snow-laden branches. Unlike Kalen's ice-like weapons, these blades seemed to be forged from polished steel, etched with intricate runes that pulsed with a faint, blue light. The hunter, momentarily surprised by Lyra's sudden appearance, paused in his advance, his obsidian eyes narrowing in assessment. He clearly hadn't anticipated facing two opponents, especially not one as skilled and agile as Lyra. 2 against 1? He sneered, his voice a low, guttural growl. Hardly a fair fight, Frostborn. Fairness has no place in this battle, Kalen retorted, his voice cold and hard, his silver eyes locked onto the hunter's. He knocked another arrow, his movements precise and economical, ready to strike at a moment's notice. Lyra, without a word, launched herself at the hunter, her movements fluid and graceful, a deadly dance of blades and shadows. She attacked with a ferocity that belied her slender frame, her swords a blur of motion, forcing the hunter to retreat, to parry, to defend himself against her relentless onslaught. Eowyn watched, mesmerized and terrified, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never witnessed such violence, such raw power, such skill. The clash of steel against steel echoed through the clearing, a sharp, metallic clang that punctuated the otherwise silent night. The hunter, though clearly surprised by Lyra's attack, was no novice. He parried her blows with a strength and speed that matched her own, his dark blade a constant threat, seeking any opening in her defense. He was larger, stronger, but Lyra was quicker, more agile, using her smaller size to her advantage, ducking and weaving around his attacks, keeping him off balance. Kalen, his bow drawn, circled the combatants, his silver eyes constantly searching for an opportunity to strike, to provide support for Lyra without endangering her. He knew that his ice arrows would be ineffective against the hunter's armor, but he could still use them to distract, to disrupt, to create an opening for Lyra to exploit. Eowyn, her hands clenched into fists, felt a surge of something within her. It wasn't fear, not entirely. It was a strange mix of adrenaline and anticipation and power. She felt a connection to the cold, to the snow, to the very air around her, a connection that was growing stronger with each passing moment. She wanted to help, to do something, to contribute to the fight, but she didn't know how. She was still learning, still struggling to understand her powers, still afraid. Suddenly, the hunter, with a roar of frustration, managed to land a blow on Lyra, his dark blade slicing through her sleeve, drawing a thin line of blood on her arm. Lyra staggered back, her face contorted in pain, but she quickly regained her footing, her grip tightening on her swords. Seeing Lyra injured, Kaelin roared in fury, releasing his arrow. This time, however, instead of aiming for the hunter's body, he aimed for the ground near his feet. The arrow struck the snow-covered ground, exploding in a shower of ice shards. The sudden burst of cold, amplified by Kaelin's frostborn power, momentarily disrupted the hunter's balance, causing him to stumble. Lyra seized the opportunity, lunging forward and striking with both swords. One blade sliced across the hunter's chest, drawing a grunt of pain, while the other grazed his cheek, leaving a thin, bleeding line. The hunter staggered back, his eyes blazing with fury. He raised his hand, and Eowyn saw that his fingers were now tipped with long, sharp claws that seemed to drip with a dark, viscous substance. "Enough of this," he growled, his voice laced with a menacing threat. "I will end you both, and then I will take the Frostborn." He lunged towards Lyra, his claws extended, ready to strike. Kaelin, seeing the danger, moved to intercept, but he was too far away. Eowyn, her heart pounding in her chest, felt a surge of power coursing through her veins. She didn't think, didn't plan. She simply reacted. She raised her hand, her fingers outstretched, and focused on the cold, on the snow, on the winter that flowed within her. A blast of frigid air erupted from her hand, a swirling vortex of snow and ice that slammed into the hunter, throwing him off balance and sending him sprawling to the ground. Silence descended upon the clearing, broken only by the ragged breathing of the combatants. The hunter lay stunned, his body covered in a thin layer of frost. Lyra and Kaelin stared at Eowyn, their eyes wide with surprise and admiration. Eowyn looked at her hand, trembling slightly, her mind reeling from what she had just done. She had used her power. She had defended herself and others. She had embraced her destiny. But this small victory felt precarious. Above, the frozen moon seemed to watch. Chapter 10. The Heart of the Storm. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the ragged breathing of the combatants and the faint crackling of the frost that now coated the hunter's prone form. Eowyn stared at her hand, still outstretched, as if she couldn't quite believe what it had just done. A faint, ethereal glow emanated from her fingertips, a subtle shimmer of silver and blue that mirrored the colors of her eyes and Kaelin's. Kaelin was the first to break the silence, his voice a low, odd murmur. "Owen, you did it." He moved towards her, his silver eyes shining with a mixture of pride and something else. Something deeper, something that made her heart skip a beat. He reached out and gently took her hand, his touch sending a familiar jolt of energy through her, a feeling of connection, of belonging. Lyra, too, approached, her expression a mixture of surprise and relief. She sheathed her swords, her gaze fixed on Eowyn. "That was remarkable," she said, her voice soft, yet filled with admiration. "You have a natural talent, Eowyn. A power that is raw, but potent." Eowyn's cheeks flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and pride. She had never considered herself to be powerful, to be capable of such magic. But the evidence was undeniable. She had used her power, instinctively, without training, without even fully understanding what she was doing. The hunter, however, was not defeated. He began to stir, groaning, his frost-covered body slowly regaining its mobility. He pushed himself up, his movements sluggish at first, but gaining strength with each passing second. "You may have slowed me down, Frostborn," he growled, his voice laced with a menacing threat, his obsidian eyes fixed on Eowyn.
"But you have not defeated me."
"The shadow blight is eternal." He rose to his feet, his claws extended, his dark blade still clutched in his hand. He was wounded, yes, but he was far from finished. Kaelin stepped forward, placing himself between Eowyn and the hunter, his bow drawn, his body tense, ready to defend her. "You will not touch her," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Lyra, too, positioned herself protectively beside Eowyn, her hands resting on the hilts of her sheathed swords. "We will not let you harm her," she added, her voice firm, unwavering. The hunter chuckled, a low, humorless sound that echoed through the clearing. "You cannot protect her forever," he said. "The shadow blight will find her. We always do." He turned and, with a surprising burst of speed, vanished into the darkness of the woods, his parting words hanging in the air like a chilling prophecy. Eowyn shivered, not from the cold, but from the sheer malice that had dripped from the hunter's voice. She knew, instinctively, that this was not the last she would see of him, or of the shadow blight. "We need to leave," Kaelin said, his voice urgent, his gaze scanning the surrounding trees. "This place is no longer safe." Lyra nodded in agreement. "He will return," she said, "and he will bring others." They quickly gathered their belongings, extinguishing the fire and securing the cabin. Eowyn, still shaken by the encounter, felt a growing sense of unease, of vulnerability. "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "To a place where the shadow blight will have difficulty finding us," Kaelin replied. "To a place of greater power, of ancient magic."
"To the heart of the storm."
The heart of the storm. The name resonated within Eowyn, a chord struck deep within her soul, echoing with a familiarity that defied logic. It was a place she had heard of in her dreams, in the fragmented memories that had been surfacing since her awakening. What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "It is a place of convergence," Lyra explained. "A place where the veil between worlds is thin. A place where the power of winter is at its strongest. It is also a place of great danger," Kaelin added, his voice somber. "But it is our best hope. It is where you will complete your training, Eowyn. It is where you will become who you were meant to be. Become who you were meant to be." The words echoed in Eowyn's mind, a mixture of fear and anticipation swirling within her. She was embarking on a journey, not just a physical journey, but a journey of self-discovery, of transformation. As they left the clearing, heading deeper into the woods, under the watchful gaze of the frozen moon, Eowyn knew that her life had changed forever. The quiet bookstore owner was gone, replaced by a woman of power, of destiny, a woman bound to winter. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger. But there was something else as well, wasn't there? Hope. Chapter 11. Thawing Secrets. The journey to the heart of the storm was arduous. Relentless trek through snow-covered forests, across frozen rivers, and over treacherous mountain passes. The unnatural winter that had gripped the land showed no signs of abating, the biting wind and swirling snow a constant reminder of the power Eowyn now wielded and the danger that pursued her. Kaelin led the way, his movements sure and confident, his senses constantly alert for any sign of the shadow blight. He was a stoic guide, his words few and measured, but his presence was a constant reassurance to Eowyn, a source of strength and protection in this unfamiliar and hostile environment. Lyra walked beside Eowyn, offering her guidance and support, sharing her knowledge of the Frostborn lineage, of the ancient magic that flowed through their veins. She was a patient teacher, answering Eowyn's countless questions with a gentle wisdom that eased her anxieties and fostered her growing understanding. As they traveled, Eowyn began to experiment with her powers, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. She learned to summon small gusts of wind, to create delicate sculptures of ice, to sense the subtle shifts in the energy of the winter landscape. It was a slow, gradual process, filled with both successes and failures, but with each small victory, her confidence grew, her fear diminished. One evening, as they huddled around a small, carefully concealed campfire, Lyra decided it was time to reveal a deeper truth to Eowyn, a secret that had been kept hidden for generations. "Eowyn," she began, her voice soft, yet serious, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "There is something you need to know about your heritage, about the origin of your powers." Eowyn looked at her, her heart pounding in her chest, a sense of anticipation and trepidation swirling within her. She had a feeling that whatever Lyra was about to reveal would change her understanding of herself, of her destiny, forever. "The Frostborn," Lyra continued, "were not always as we are now. We were not always bound to the winter. We were once part of something else. Something greater." She paused, taking a deep breath, as if steeling herself for what she was about to say. "We were once part of the summer court," she revealed, her voice barely a whisper. "Children of the sun, of warmth, of light. We were Fae."
Fae.
The word hung in the air, heavy with implications. Eowyn's mind reeled. Fairies? Creatures of myth and legend? It was even more fantastical than anything she had imagined. "But how?" she stammered, her voice filled with disbelief. "How is that possible?" "Long ago," Lyra explained, "there was a schism, a great divide within the Fae realm. A conflict between the summer court and the winter court. A battle for power, for control, for the very balance of the seasons. And we lost?" Eowyn asked, her voice barely a whisper. Lyra shook her head. "It was not a simple victory or defeat," she said. "It was a compromise.
A pact.
A sacrifice. To end the war, to prevent the destruction of both courts, a group of Fae from the summer court volunteered to embrace the winter. To become the Frostborn. They gave up their warmth, their light, their essence," Kaelin added, his voice a low, somber rumble. "They bound themselves to the winter, to the cold, to the darkness, in order to maintain the balance, to prevent the world from falling into eternal summer or eternal winter." Eowyn's mind struggled to grasp the enormity of this revelation. Her ancestors, her lineage, had made a conscious choice, a sacrifice of unimaginable proportions, to save their world. And she, now, was a descendant of that sacrifice, a carrier of that ancient burden. "So the Shadow Blight," she said, her voice trembling slightly. They are descendants of those who refused the pact," Lyra confirmed. "Those who clung to the old ways, who sought to dominate, to control, to plunge the world into eternal darkness. They are twisted, corrupted versions of what we once were." The truth was a heavy weight, a burden that settled upon Eowyn's shoulders. She was not just fighting for her own survival, for her own future. She was fighting for the legacy of her ancestors, for the balance of the world, for the very survival of everything. But as the secrets thawed, a sense of grim determination bloomed in her heart. The fire danced, casting shadows around them, and as she looked into them, she saw a long road and a purpose. Chapter 12. Scars of the Past. The revelation of the Frostborn's origins hung heavy in the air, a profound silence settling over the small campsite. Eowyn stared into the flickering flames, her mind grappling with the weight of this newfound knowledge, with the echoes of a past she had never known, yet felt deeply connected to. Kaelin, sensing her turmoil, moved closer, his presence a comforting warmth against the biting cold of the night. He didn't speak, didn't offer empty platitudes or false reassurances. He simply sat beside her, his silence a silent acknowledgement of the burden she now carried. Lyra, too, remained quiet, allowing Eowyn the time and space to process the information, to come to terms with the truth of her heritage. She knew that this revelation was not just a historical account, it was a deeply personal unveiling, a stripping away of layers of self-deception, of a carefully constructed identity that had been built upon a foundation of ignorance. After a long while, Eowyn finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper, yet filled with a newfound resolve. "So my destiny," she said, her gaze meeting Kaylin's, is not just about fighting the shadow blight. It's about reclaiming what was lost. It's about restoring balance not just to the world, but to ourselves. Kaylin nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. You understand, he said, his voice a low, resonant murmur. It is not just about defeating an enemy. It is about healing. It is about becoming whole. Healing. The word resonated deeply within Eowyn. She thought of the years she had spent feeling incomplete, of the gnawing emptiness she had never been able to fill, of the sense of displacement that had always haunted her. Now, she understood the source of that feeling. It was the echo of a lost heritage, of a severed connection to her true self. Lyra, Eowyn said, turning to face the other woman, her voice filled with a newfound curiosity. Tell me more about the summer court. Tell me about what we were. Lyra smiled gently, her eyes filled with a bittersweet nostalgia. We were creatures of light and warmth, she began, her voice soft and melodic, like the gentle murmur of a summer breeze. We danced in sun-drenched meadows, we sang with the birds, we reveled in the beauty and abundance of the natural world. She described a world of vibrant colors, of fragrant flowers, of shimmering waterfalls, of creatures both magical and mundane, living in harmony with one another. It was a world of joy, of laughter, of freedom. A world that was the antithesis of the cold, harsh reality of the Frostborn existence. As Lyra spoke, Eowyn felt a pang of longing, a deep yearning for a world she had never known, yet felt instinctively connected to. She closed her eyes, imagining herself in that sun-drenched meadow, feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin, hearing the laughter of her fellow Fae, feeling the wholeness that had eluded her for so long. But the image was fleeting, replaced by the stark reality of the snow-covered landscape that surrounded them, of the biting wind that whipped through the trees, of the ever-present threat of the shadow blight. It sounds beautiful, Eowyn said, her voice tinged with a hint of sadness. But it's gone, isn't it? Lost forever. Lyra shook her head. Not lost, she said, her voice firm, unwavering. Dormant, perhaps. Hidden. But not lost. The memory of the summer court lives on. Within us, within our blood, within our souls. And it is that memory, that hope, that we must cling to. It is that light that we must strive to rekindle. Rekindle. The word sparked a flicker of hope within Eowyn's heart. It was not just about defeating the darkness, it was about embracing the light. It was not just about fighting the shadow blight, it was about reclaiming the joy, the beauty, the wholeness that had been lost. Kaylin reached out and gently took Eowyn's hand, his touch sending a familiar jolt of energy through her, a feeling of connection, of love. We all carry scars, Owen, he said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. Scars of the past, scars of loss, scars of sacrifice. But scars are not weaknesses. They are reminders of our strength, of our resilience, of our ability to heal. His words resonated deeply within Eowyn. She thought of her own scars, both visible and invisible, the scars of a life lived in quiet desperation, of unfulfilled dreams, of a heart that had been frozen for far too long. She looked at Kaylin, at his silver eyes that held a depth of understanding, of compassion, of love, and she knew that he, too, carried scars. Scars of a past he rarely spoke of, scars of a burden he had carried for centuries. She squeezed his hand. The scars, however, were also the proof of survival, and possibly the guide to a new path. The fire popped, casting a warm glow. But would warmth be enough in this frozen land? Chapter 13. A Choice of Destiny. The warmth of Kaylin's hand in hers was a small comfort against the vast, unforgiving cold of the wilderness. His words about scars, about healing, echoed in her mind, mingling with Lyra's tales of the summer court, creating a tapestry of loss and hope, of darkness and light, that mirrored the complex emotions swirling within her. As they continued their journey towards the heart of the storm, Eowyn found herself increasingly drawn to Kaylin, not just as a protector, as a guide, but as a companion. She found solace in his quiet strength, in his unwavering loyalty, in the subtle gestures of affection that spoke volumes more than words. She noticed the way his silver eyes softened when he looked at her, the way his hand instinctively reached for hers when the terrain grew treacherous, the way he always positioned himself between her and any potential danger. These small acts, seemingly insignificant, were threads of connection, weaving a bond between them that transcended the shared danger, the forced proximity, the soul bond. One day, as they rested beside a frozen waterfall, its cascading water transformed into a breathtaking sculpture of ice, Eowyn found the courage to ask Kaelin about his past, about the scars he carried. "You rarely speak of yourself," she said, her voice soft, hesitant, her gaze fixed on the intricate patterns of the frozen waterfall.
"Of your life before me."
Kaelin was silent for a long moment, his gaze drifting towards the distant, snow-capped peaks, his expression unreadable. Eowyn wondered if she had overstepped, if she had ventured into territory that was too painful, too private. But then, he turned to her, his silver eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "There is not much to tell," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. "My life has been one of duty, of obligation, of sacrifice. I have been a guardian of the northern wastes for centuries, protecting the Frostborn, fighting the shadow blight. It is a lonely existence, a life devoid of joy, of connection." He paused, a flicker of pain crossing his face. "I had a family once," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "A wife, a child. But they were lost, taken by the shadow blight, long ago." Eowyn's heart ached for him. She could only imagine the pain, the grief, the emptiness he must have endured for centuries. She reached out and gently touched his arm, her touch conveying a silent message of empathy, of understanding. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice filled with compassion. He nodded, a faint smile touching his lips.
"It was a long time ago," he said.
"But the scars remain. But you're not alone anymore," Eowyn said, her voice firm, unwavering. "You have us. You have me." His silver eyes met hers, holding a depth of emotion that made her breath catch in her throat. He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hand, his touch sending a shiver of warmth through her, despite the cold air that surrounded them. "You have brought light back into my life, Eowyn," he said, his voice a low, husky murmur. "You have given me hope. You have shown me that even in the depths of winter, there can be warmth." His words were a confession, a vulnerability that he rarely allowed himself to express. And they were a confirmation of the feelings that had been growing within her, the feelings that she had been trying to deny, to suppress, for fear of rejection, of loss. But she could no longer deny them. She was falling in love with Kaelin, with this stoic, enigmatic guardian, with this man who had lived for centuries in the shadows, who had sacrificed everything for his duty, for his people. She leaned into his touch, her heart pounding in her chest, her gaze locked onto his. "And you, Kaelin," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "have shown me that even in the midst of darkness, there can be light." He leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, tentative kiss at first, then deepening, becoming more passionate, more desperate. It was a kiss that spoke of longing, of connection, of a love that had been forged in the crucible of shared danger, of shared destiny. But as they kissed, a sudden chill ran through Eowyn, a premonition of danger, a warning that shattered the moment of intimacy. She pulled away, her eyes wide with alarm. "Something's wrong," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Kaelin, instantly alert, his senses scanning the surroundings, nodded in agreement. "I feel it too," he said, his voice tense, his hand reaching for his blade. They were no longer alone. The shadow blight had found them, and Eowyn knew that she would have to make a choice. A choice between love and duty, between personal happiness and the fate of the world. A choice of destiny. The kiss, a spark, now a memory. Because, surrounding them, the shadows were growing. And her choice would define not only their future, but also the future of everything they knew. Chapter 14. The Price of Warmth. The shadows that enveloped them weren't merely the absence of light, they were a tangible presence, a creeping cold that seeped into their bones, a chilling premonition of the danger that was rapidly approaching. The air grew heavy, the silence oppressive, punctuated only by the ragged breathing of Eowyn and Kaelin and the faint, almost imperceptible whisper of the wind, which now seemed to carry a menacing undertone. Lyra, who had been scouting ahead, returned with a grim expression on her face. "They're here," she said, her voice low and urgent. "A large group. More than we've encountered before." Kaelin nodded, his jaw tight, his silver eyes scanning the surrounding forest.
"We need to move," he said. "Quickly."
But Eowyn hesitated. She looked at Kaelin, at Lyra, her heart pounding in her chest, a sense of dread and determination swirling within her. She knew that running, hiding, was no longer an option. They were heading towards the heart of the storm, towards a confrontation that was inevitable, a battle that would determine not just their fate, but the fate of the world. "No," she said, her voice firm, unwavering, surprising even herself with her newfound conviction. "We fight. Here.
Now."
Kaelin and Lyra exchanged a surprised glance, their expressions a mixture of concern and admiration. They had seen her grow, evolve, from a timid bookstore owner to a woman of power, of courage, but this was a new level of resolve, a willingness to face the danger head-on, to embrace her destiny, no matter the cost. "Eowyn," Kaelin began, his voice filled with a mixture of warning and pride. "You're not fully trained." "This is I know," she interrupted, her voice steady, her gaze meeting his. "But I'm not afraid anymore. I'm tired of running, of hiding. I'm ready to fight. For myself, for us, for everything." Her words hung in the air, a declaration of intent, a challenge to the approaching darkness. Kaelin studied her face, searching for any sign of doubt, of fear, but he found only determination, a fierce resolve that mirrored his own. He nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Then we fight together," he said, his voice a low, resonant murmur.
"As one."
Lyra, too, nodded in agreement. "We stand with you, Owen," she said, her voice firm, unwavering. "We are Frostborn.
We do not yield."
They prepared for battle, positioning themselves strategically amongst the trees, using the frozen landscape to their advantage. Kaelin, with his bow and ice arrows, took a position that allowed him to provide cover to disrupt the enemy's advance. Lyra, with her twin swords, prepared to engage in close-quarters combat, her agility and skill a formidable defense. Eowyn, her heart pounding in her chest, focused on the cold, on the winter that flowed within her, drawing upon the power that had been awakened within her, the power that was both terrifying and exhilarating. She felt the energy coursing through her veins, a tingling sensation that spread from her fingertips to the tips of her toes, a feeling of connection, of control. The shadow blight emerged from the darkness, a horde of twisted, corrupted creatures, their forms shrouded in shadow, their eyes glowing with a malevolent red light. They were armed with a variety of weapons, dark blades, jagged claws, and weapons that seemed to be forged from the very shadows themselves. The battle began, a chaotic clash of ice and shadow, of steel and magic. Kaelin's arrows flew with deadly accuracy, striking the enemy, slowing their advance, but their numbers were overwhelming. Lyra fought with a fierce grace, her swords a blur of motion, cutting down those who dared to approach her, but she was quickly surrounded, outnumbered. Eowyn, channeling her power, unleashed a torrent of frigid air, creating a swirling vortex of snow and ice that slammed into the advancing horde, throwing them off balance, freezing them in their tracks. But the Shadow Blight were relentless, their numbers seemingly endless, their determination fueled by a dark, insatiable hunger. As the battle raged, Eowyn realized that they were losing. They were outnumbered, outmatched, their strength waning against the relentless onslaught of the enemy. She saw Kaelin take a blow, a dark blade slicing across his arm, drawing a cry of pain. She saw Lyra stumble, overwhelmed by the sheer number of attackers. And then she saw him, the hunter, the one who had attacked them at the cabin, the one who had vowed to claim her for the Shadow Blight. He stood at the edge of the battle, his obsidian eyes fixed on her, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He raised his hand, and Eowyn felt a sharp, agonizing pain in her chest, a feeling as if her very soul was being ripped apart. She staggered back, clutching her chest, her vision blurring, her strength failing. The soul bond. He was using the soul bond against her, exploiting the connection between her and Kaelin, using it to weaken her, to break her. She looked at Kaelin, his face contorted in pain, his silver eyes filled with anguish. He knew what was happening, and he was powerless to stop it. The hunter approached, his smile widening, his dark blade gleaming in the faint light. "It is over, Frostborn," he said, his voice a low, guttural growl. "You will be ours." Eowyn, her body trembling, her spirit faltering, knew that he was right. She had fought bravely, but it wasn't enough. She was about to lose everything. Love, hope, life. But at that very moment came a choice. A sacrifice. She knew it. Chapter 15. The Wolf's Howl. The hunter advanced, his dark blade poised to strike, his obsidian eyes filled with a triumphant malice. Eowyn, weakened and vulnerable, could only watch, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing, desperately searching for a way out, a way to save herself, to save Kaelin, to save everything. But there was no escape. The hunter was too close, his blade too swift, her strength too depleted. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable, for the final, crushing blow that would end her life, her journey, her love. But the blow never came. Instead, she heard a roar, a primal, savage roar that echoed through the clearing, shaking the very ground beneath her feet. She opened her eyes, her vision blurry, and saw a blur of white fur, a flash of silver eyes, a whirlwind of motion and fury. Kaelin. He had transformed. He was no longer the stoic, enigmatic guardian she had come to know and love. He was a wolf, a magnificent, terrifying creature of immense size and power, his fur the color of freshly fallen snow, his eyes gleaming with a fierce, untamed light. The transformation, a secret he had guarded for centuries, a power he had only used in the direst of circumstances, was now unleashed. The soul bond, the very thing the hunter had sought to exploit, had triggered it, a desperate act of protection, of love, of defiance. The wolf that was Kaelin lunged at the hunter, a blur of white fur and sharp teeth, knocking him off his feet, sending his dark blade flying into the snow. The hunter, caught completely off guard, scrambled back, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fear. He had faced Frostborn warriors before, but he had never faced anything like this. This was not the controlled, calculated power of a trained warrior. This was the raw, untamed fury of nature itself, a force of winter unleashed. The wolf that was Kaelin attacked with a ferocity that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. He tore at the hunter with his claws, bit at him with his fangs, his movements too swift, too powerful for the hunter to defend against. The other Shadow Blight creatures, momentarily stunned by the sudden transformation, hesitated, their advance faltering. Lyra, seeing an opportunity, pressed her attack, her twin swords a whirlwind of motion, driving them back, forcing them to retreat. Eowyn, her strength slowly returning, watched in amazement, her heart filled with a mixture of awe and relief. Kaelin, her Kaelin, had saved her. He had risked everything, revealed his deepest secret, to protect her. The battle raged on, but the tide had turned. The wolf that was Kaelin was an unstoppable force, a whirlwind of destruction, tearing through the ranks of the Shadow Blight, driving them back, forcing them to flee. The hunter, wounded and defeated, managed to escape, vanishing into the darkness of the woods, his parting words a chilling vow of revenge. But the victory was costly. As the last of the Shadow Blight creatures retreated, Kaelin, still in his wolf form, collapsed to the ground, his body trembling, his breathing ragged. The transformation, though powerful, had taken a toll on him, draining his energy, pushing him to the brink of exhaustion. Eowyn rushed to his side, her heart filled with concern. She knelt beside him, gently stroking his fur, her touch soothing, calming. "Kaelin," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "Kaelin, it's all right. You're safe now. You saved us." Slowly, painfully, Kaelin began to transform back into his human form. The process was agonizing to watch, his bones shifting, his muscles contorting, his body racked with spasms. When the transformation was complete, he lay on the ground, naked and vulnerable, his body covered in sweat and blood, his breathing shallow and uneven. Eowyn, without hesitation, removed her own cloak and wrapped it around him, shielding him from the cold, offering him what little comfort she could. She looked at him, at his pale face, at his closed eyes, at the scars that crisscrossed his body, and she knew that she loved him, more deeply, more completely, than she had ever thought possible. He had saved her, not just from the shadow blight, but from herself, from the fear, the doubt, the emptiness that had haunted her for so long. He had shown her the true meaning of courage, of sacrifice, of love. But the howl of the wolf was the call of the wild. And she knew that a deep change had happened. Would he be able to fully return? Or had the wolf claimed him? Chapter 16. Into the Frozen Wilds. Kaelin's recovery was slow and arduous. The transformation, the sheer exertion of the battle, had left him weak and vulnerable, his body pushed to its limits. Eowyn tended to him tirelessly, her concern a constant, unwavering presence, her touch a soothing balm on his wounded body and spirit. Lyra, with her knowledge of herbs and healing magic, provided what aid she could, brewing potent potions and applying soothing salves, but the true healing came from within, from Kaelin's own resilience, and from the unwavering support of Eowyn. As Kaelin slowly regained his strength, Eowyn couldn't shake the fear that lingered in the back of her mind, the fear that the wolf, once unleashed, might have claimed a part of him he couldn't retrieve. She watched him closely, searching for any sign of change, any indication that the transformation had altered him in some fundamental way. He was quieter, more withdrawn, his silver eyes often clouded with a distant, haunted look. He spoke less, his words measured and careful, as if he were afraid of revealing too much, of letting the wolf slip out again. One evening, as they sat huddled around a small fire, Eowyn finally voiced her fears. "Kaelin," she began, her voice hesitant, her gaze searching his face. "Are you all right? You seem different." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames, his expression unreadable. Eowyn wondered if he would even answer, if he would retreat further into his silence, into the wilderness that now seemed to reside within him. But then, he turned to her, his silver eyes meeting hers, holding a depth of emotion that made her heart ache. "I am changed, Owen," he admitted, his voice a low, rough murmur. "The wolf is closer to the surface now. It is harder to control." His words confirmed her fears, but they also sparked a flicker of understanding. She had seen the wolf. She had witnessed its power, its ferocity, its beauty. She knew that it was a part of him, an integral part of his being, and she couldn't expect him to simply suppress it, to deny its existence. "It's all right," she said, her voice soft, reassuring. "I understand. And I'm not afraid. I accept you, Kaelin. All of you. The man and the wolf." Her words, spoken with such sincerity, such unwavering acceptance, seemed to break through the wall he had erected around himself. A faint smile touched his lips, a flicker of warmth returning to his eyes. "Thank you, Eowyn," he said, his voice a low, husky murmur. "That means more than you know." He reached out and gently took her hand, his touch sending a familiar jolt of energy through her, a feeling of connection, of love. But this time, the connection felt different. It was stronger, deeper, more primal. It was a connection that transcended the human realm, a connection that bound them together, not just as lovers, but as kindred spirits. Despite Kalen's weakened state, they knew they couldn't stay where they were. The Shadow Blight would be searching for them, and the location of their previous battle was too exposed, too vulnerable. They had to continue their journey to the heart of the storm, to the place where Eowyn could complete her training, where they could find a way to defeat the Shadow Blight, once and for all. They set off again, traveling deeper into the frozen wilderness, the landscape becoming increasingly harsh and unforgiving. The mountains loomed before them, their snow-capped peaks piercing the sky, their slopes treacherous and unforgiving. The wind howled relentlessly, whipping the snow into blinding swirls, making it difficult to see, to breathe, to think. Eowyn, drawing upon her own growing powers, helped them navigate the treacherous terrain, creating pathways of ice, shielding them from the biting wind, summoning gusts of warm air to ward off the bone-chilling cold. She was no longer the timid bookstore owner she had once been. She was a Frostborn warrior, a woman of power, of resilience, of destiny. As they journeyed, Kalen began to teach her more about his wolf form, about the ancient magic that flowed through his veins, about the connection between the Frostborn and the creatures of the winter wilderness. He taught her how to listen to the wind, to read the signs of the snow, to sense the presence of other living beings, both human and animal. He taught her how to embrace the wildness within herself, to tap into the primal instincts that lay dormant within her, to connect with the wolf that was now a part of her, through their bond. It was a journey of transformation, not just for Eowyn, but for Kalen as well. He was learning to accept, to embrace the wolf within him, to integrate it into his being, to find a balance between the man and the beast. And as they journeyed, their love for each other deepened, strengthened, becoming a beacon of hope in the midst of the darkness, a source of warmth in the heart of the frozen wilds. But the wilds were perilous, and ahead of them waited not only power, but also pain. Chapter 17. The Ancient Pact. The closer they drew to the heart of the storm, the more intense the landscape became. Jagged peaks clawed at the sky, their slopes covered in treacherous ice fields. The wind, a constant, howling presence, whipped the snow into blinding frenzies, making every step a struggle. The air itself crackled with an almost palpable energy, a raw, untamed power that both invigorated and intimidated. Eowyn, drawing upon her growing connection to the winter, found herself increasingly able to navigate this hostile environment. She could sense the subtle shifts in the ice, anticipate the treacherous crevasses, summon gusts of wind to clear their path. But even with her powers, the journey was arduous, a constant test of their endurance, their resilience, their bond. One evening, as they sheltered in a small ice cave, seeking refuge from a particularly fierce blizzard, Kalen decided it was time to reveal the final, crucial piece of the puzzle, the truth about the heart of the storm itself. The heart of the storm, he began, his voice low and resonant, his silver eyes fixed on the swirling snow outside the cave entrance, is not just a place of power, Eowyn. It is a prison. Eowyn looked at him, her brow furrowing in confusion. A prison? She repeated, her voice barely a whisper. What do you mean? Long ago, Kalen explained, when the Frostborn made their pact with the Winter Court, they did not simply embrace the cold. They also agreed to contain it, to prevent it from overwhelming the world, from plunging it into eternal winter. He paused, taking a deep breath, as if the weight of this ancient history pressed heavily upon him. The heart of the storm, he continued, is the focal point of that containment. It is where the raw, untamed power of winter is bound. It is where the essence of the Winter Court itself resides. And who is imprisoned there? Eowyn asked, her voice trembling slightly, a sense of foreboding creeping over her. Kalen's gaze met hers, his silver eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. The Queen of Winter, he said, his voice barely a whisper. The one who made the pact with the Frostborn. The one who sacrificed everything to maintain the balance. The Queen of Winter. The words resonated within Eowyn, a chord struck deep within her soul, echoing with a familiarity that defied logic. She had heard of her in her dreams, in the fragmented memories that had been surfacing since her awakening. A figure of immense power, of tragic beauty, of profound loneliness.
But why?
Eowyn asked. Why is she imprisoned? She is not imprisoned in the traditional sense, Lyra interjected, her voice soft, yet firm. She is bound. Bound to the heart of the storm, bound to the power of winter, bound to the responsibility of maintaining the balance. She volunteered, Kaelin added, his voice heavy with emotion. She chose to sacrifice her own freedom, her own happiness, to prevent the world from being consumed by either eternal summer or eternal winter. It was the only way to end the war, to save both the summer and winter courts. Eowyn's mind reeled. The Queen of Winter, a figure of myth and legend, was real. And she was trapped, imprisoned within the very heart of the power that Eowyn now wielded. And the Shadow Blight, Eowyn said, her voice trembling slightly. What do they want with the heart of the storm? They seek to release her, Kaelin replied, his voice grim. But not to free her. To control her. To use her power to plunge the world into eternal darkness. The stakes were higher than Eowyn had ever imagined. It was not just about defeating the Shadow Blight, it was about protecting the Queen of Winter, about maintaining the balance, about saving the world. So what must I do? Eowyn asked, her voice firm, unwavering, her gaze meeting Kaelin's. You must learn to control your powers, Eowyn, Kaelin said. To master them completely. You must become strong enough to face the Queen, to understand her, to help her. Help her? The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. Eowyn, a former bookstore owner, was being asked to confront a being of immense power, a queen of a mythical realm. But she knew she couldn't refuse. It was her destiny, her responsibility, her calling. I will, she said, her voice filled with a newfound determination. I will do whatever it takes. The blizzard raged outside, a reflection of the turmoil within Eowyn's heart, of the daunting task that lay ahead. But amidst the fear, the doubt, the uncertainty, there was also a flicker of hope. Hope that she could succeed, that she could save the Queen, that she could save the world, that she could find her own balance, her own peace, her own love. The ancient pact had been made. But should it be broken? Chapter 18. Betrayal's Bitter Sting. The final ascent to the heart of the storm was the most perilous yet. The landscape was a brutal expanse of jagged ice and swirling snow, the wind a relentless, howling force that threatened to tear them from the mountainside. The air itself crackled with an almost unbearable energy, a raw, untamed power that made Eowyn's skin tingle and her head ache. But they pressed on, driven by a sense of urgency, by the knowledge that the Shadow Blight were closing in, by the weight of the responsibility that rested upon Eowyn's shoulders. As they neared their destination, Eowyn began to feel a strange pull, a drawing sensation that seemed to emanate from the very core of the mountain. It was a feeling of connection, of recognition, as if some part of her had been here before, as if she were returning to a place she had long forgotten. Finally, they reached it. The heart of the storm was not a physical structure, not a castle or a fortress, but a swirling vortex of energy, a maelstrom of ice and snow that pulsed with a blinding light. It was a breathtaking, terrifying sight, a manifestation of the raw, untamed power of winter itself. Standing before it, Eowyn felt a surge of fear, of doubt, of inadequacy. How could she, a mere mortal, a former bookstore owner, possibly hope to control such power, to face the being that was bound within it? But she had no time for doubt. As they approached the vortex, a figure emerged from the swirling snow, a figure that sent a jolt of shock and disbelief through Eowyn. It was Lyra, but she was different. Her eyes, once warm and welcoming, were now cold and hard, like chips of obsidian. Her expression, once gentle and compassionate, was now twisted with a cruel, malevolent smile. And in her hands, she held not her twin swords, but a staff of dark, twisted wood, its top adorned with a pulsating, black crystal that seemed to radiate an aura of malice. Lyra? Eowyn stammered, her voice filled with confusion and betrayal. What's going on? Lyra chuckled, a low, humorless sound that echoed through the clearing. Foolish girl, she said, her voice dripping with contempt. Did you really think I was on your side? Did you really believe all those stories of the summer court, of the Frostborn sacrifice? Eowyn's mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. Lyra, her mentor, her friend, her confidant, was a traitor. You're with the Shadow Blight? She whispered, her voice trembling. Lyra nodded, her smile widening. Always, she said. From the very beginning. I was sent to guide you, to prepare you, to deliver you to the heart of the storm.
But why?
Eowyn asked, her heart breaking with each word. Why would you do this? Because the Shadow Blight are the true inheritors of this world, Lyra said, her voice filled with a fanatic zeal. They are the ones who will restore the balance, who will extinguish the weak, who will rule. She raised her staff, the black crystal pulsing with a menacing light. And you, Eowyn, she said, are the key. Your power, combined with the Queen's, will be unstoppable. Together, we will plunge the world into eternal darkness. Kaelin, who had been stunned into silence by Lyra's betrayal, finally found his voice.
Lyra, no.
He roared, his voice filled with anguish and rage. Don't do this. It's not too late. You can still choose the light. Lyra laughed, a cold, mocking sound. The light is weak, she said. The light is fleeting. Only the darkness endures. She lunged at Eowyn, her staff aimed at her heart. Kaelin, with a roar of fury, transformed into his wolf form, a blur of white fur and sharp teeth, intercepting Lyra's attack, knocking her off balance. The battle began, a desperate struggle between light and darkness, between loyalty and betrayal, between love and hate. Eowyn, her heart shattered, her mind reeling, found herself facing a choice. She could succumb to the despair, to the pain, to the betrayal, or she could fight. She chose to fight. Drawing upon the power of the winter, upon the connection to Kaelin, upon the memory of the summer court, upon the hope that still flickered within her, she unleashed a torrent of icy energy, a blast of pure, untamed power that slammed into Lyra, throwing her back against the swirling vortex of the heart of the storm. The betrayal cut deep, but the Queen waited, and so did the battle. And so, she fought, with a broken heart, and with the burning cold of winter. Chapter 19. Rekindled Flames. The force of Eowyn's attack sent Lyra sprawling, her body slamming against the swirling vortex of the heart of the storm. The black crystal on her staff pulsed erratically, its dark energy flickering and sputtering as it came into contact with the raw, untamed power of winter. Lyra, stunned but not defeated, struggled to her feet, her eyes blazing with fury and pain. The betrayal she had inflicted upon Eowyn was now mirrored in her own expression, a reflection of the deep-seated conflict that raged within her. You cannot win, Eowyn, she spat, her voice hoarse, her body trembling with exertion. The darkness is inevitable. It is our destiny. Eowyn, her own heart aching with the pain of Lyra's betrayal, stood firm, her gaze unwavering, her body radiating a powerful aura of winter energy. No, she said, her voice strong and clear, echoing through the swirling vortex. Our destiny is not predetermined. We choose our own path. And I choose the light. She raised her hands, summoning the full force of her Frostborn power, channeling the energy of the heart of the storm itself. The air around her crackled with an almost unbearable intensity, the snow and ice swirling into a blinding vortex, a miniature replica of the maelstrom that raged behind her. Kaelin, still in his wolf form, circled protectively around Eowyn, his silver eyes fixed on Lyra, his growls a constant, menacing threat. He was ready to strike, to defend Eowyn with his life, but he also knew that this was her battle, her choice, her destiny. Lyra, seeing the power that Eowyn now wielded, hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. She had underestimated her, underestimated the strength of her connection to the winter, to the heart of the storm, to Kaelin. But it was too late to retreat. She had made her choice, and she would see it through to the bitter end. She raised her staff again, the black crystal pulsing with a renewed intensity, channeling the dark energy of the shadow blight. "Then you will die," she said, her voice filled with a chilling resolve. The two women faced each other, a stark contrast of light and darkness, of hope and despair, of love and hate. They were two sides of the same coin, two reflections of a past that had been shattered, of a future that hung precariously in the balance. The battle that ensued was unlike anything Eowyn had ever experienced. It was not a physical struggle, not a clash of blades or claws, but a battle of wills, a clash of energies, a contest of souls. Eowyn, drawing upon the power of the winter, unleashed a torrent of icy blasts, swirling snowstorms, and razor-sharp shards of ice, each attack aimed at breaking Lyra's will, at shattering her connection to the darkness. Lyra, fueled by the dark energy of the shadow blight, countered with blasts of shadowy energy, with illusions of fear and despair, with attempts to corrupt Eowyn's spirit, to turn her to the darkness. The air around them crackled and shimmered, the very fabric of reality seeming to warp and bend under the strain of their opposing powers. The heart of the storm pulsed erratically, its blinding light flickering and dimming, reflecting the ebb and flow of the battle. As the battle raged, Eowyn began to understand Lyra, to see beyond the betrayal, to the pain, the fear, the loneliness that had driven her to embrace the darkness. She saw the remnants of the summer court fae she had once been, the flicker of light that still struggled to survive within her corrupted soul. And she realized that defeating Lyra was not about destroying her, it was about saving her. With a surge of compassion, of empathy, of love, Eowyn shifted her focus. She stopped attacking, stopped trying to overpower Lyra, and instead began to channel the pure, untainted energy of the winter, the energy of healing, of balance, of hope. She sent forth a wave of warmth, a gentle, soothing energy that enveloped Lyra, melting away the icy armor she had erected around her heart, dissolving the dark tendrils of the shadow blight that had taken root within her. Lyra cried out in pain, in confusion, in resistance. But the warmth persisted, unwavering, relentless, a force of love that could not be denied. Slowly, gradually, Lyra's resistance began to crumble. The dark energy that had fueled her attacks began to dissipate, the black crystal on her staff flickering and dimming, its power waning. Her eyes, once cold and hard, began to soften, to fill with tears. Her expression, once twisted with malice, began to relax, to reveal the pain, the regret, the longing that she had suppressed for so long. Finally, with a sob that racked her entire body, Lyra collapsed to her knees, her staff falling from her grasp, the black crystal shattering into 1,000 pieces. "Eowyn," she whispered, her voice hoarse, filled with remorse.
I'm sorry.
"I was lost." Eowyn rushed to her side, kneeling beside her, taking her hands in hers. "It's all right, Lyra," she said, her voice filled with compassion. "You're found now. You're home." The warmth that had emanated from Eowyn now enveloped them both, a healing balm that soothed their wounds, both physical and emotional. Kaelin, his wolf form fading, returned to his human form, his silver eyes filled with relief and love. He was by their sides in a moment. The heart of the storm, which had been raging erratically throughout the battle, now pulsed with a steady, gentle light, a beacon of hope, of balance, of renewal. The rekindled flames were not those of destruction, but of a profound understanding, a profound healing. But what about the Queen? Chapter 20. The Frostborns' Legacy. With Lyra's redemption, a profound sense of peace settled over the heart of the storm. The swirling vortex, once a chaotic maelstrom of ice and snow, now pulsed with a gentle, rhythmic energy, its blinding light softened to a warm, ethereal glow. The biting wind subsided, replaced by a stillness that was both profound and unsettling. The immediate threat was gone, but the ultimate task remained. The Queen of Winter was still bound within the heart of the storm, her power contained, her fate uncertain. Eowyn, her hand still clasped in Lyra's, turned towards the vortex, her heart pounding in her chest, a mixture of fear and anticipation swirling within her. She knew that this was the moment she had been preparing for, the culmination of her journey, the fulfillment of her destiny. "Are you ready?" Kaelin asked, his voice a low, comforting murmur, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. Eowyn nodded, her gaze fixed on the swirling vortex. I think so," she said, her voice trembling slightly. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come, and stepped towards the heart of the storm. As she approached, the vortex seemed to respond to her presence, the swirling snow and ice parting before her, creating a pathway to its core. She walked into the heart of the storm, feeling the raw, untamed power of winter surround her, envelop her, embrace her. It was a terrifying, exhilarating sensation, a feeling of connection, of belonging, that she had never experienced before. And then she saw her, the Queen of Winter. She was not what Eowyn had expected. She was not a monstrous figure of ice and snow, not a terrifying embodiment of winter's wrath. She was beautiful. She was tall and slender, with long, flowing hair the color of freshly fallen snow, her skin pale and luminous, her eyes a piercing shade of ice blue. She was clad in a gown of shimmering frost, her form radiating an aura of both power and profound sadness. She was bound, not by chains or shackles, but by strands of shimmering ice, ethereal threads that wove around her body, tethering her to the heart of the vortex, holding her captive within her own power. "You have come," the Queen said, her voice a soft, melodic chime that echoed through the swirling vortex. It was a voice filled with both weariness and hope. "I have," Eowyn replied, her voice trembling slightly, her gaze meeting the Queen's. "I am Eowyn Aldrich, a descendant of the Frostborn." The Queen studied her for a long moment, her ice-blue eyes seeming to pierce through her, seeing not just her outward appearance, but the very essence of her soul. "You carry the mark of the summer court," the Queen said, her voice a low, thoughtful murmur, a flicker of warmth within the cold. Eowyn nodded.
"I have learned of our past," she said.
"Of the sacrifice your people made. Of the burden you carry." A faint smile touched the Queen's lips, a fleeting expression that softened the harsh lines of her face. "It is a heavy burden," she said. "A burden I have carried for centuries." "I am here to help you," Eowyn said, her voice firm, unwavering. "To release you if I can. To restore the balance." The Queen's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise and hope crossing her face. "Release me?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "But the pact was made to prevent destruction," Eowyn said. "But it has become a prison. It is time for a new way. A way of balance, of harmony, of coexistence." She raised her hands, channeling the power of the winter. But this time, it was not a force of destruction, of containment, but a force of healing, of release. She focused on the strands of ice that bound the Queen, sending forth a wave of warmth, a gentle, soothing energy that began to melt the frozen bonds, to dissolve the ancient magic that held her captive. The Queen watched, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She had been bound for so long, she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be free. Slowly, gradually, the strands of ice began to melt, to dissipate, to vanish. The Queen's body trembled, her form flickering, as the ancient magic that had held her captive began to unravel. Finally, with a soft sigh, the last strand of ice dissolved, and the Queen of Winter was free. She stepped out of the vortex, her movements graceful and fluid, her form radiating an aura of immense power, of profound gratitude. "You have done it," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "You have freed me." She looked at Owen, at Kaelin, at Lyra, her eyes filled with a warmth that belied her icy appearance. "The Frostborn have fulfilled their legacy," she said. "They have proven their loyalty, their courage, their compassion. The balance has been restored." She raised her hand, and the swirling vortex of the heart of the storm began to subside, to dissipate, to vanish. The raw, untamed power of winter was no longer contained, but it was not unleashed either. It was integrated, balanced, harmonized. The legacy now was of balance and of freedom gained. And with this, winter was no longer a threat, but a promise. Epilogue. The world did not change overnight. The unnatural winter that had gripped the land did not suddenly vanish, replaced by an instant spring. But the shift was palpable, a subtle easing of the biting cold, a softening of the harsh landscape, a promise of warmth to come. The release of the Queen of Winter had not unleashed chaos, as the Shadow Blight had intended, but had instead ushered in an era of balance. The power of winter was no longer a force to be feared, to be contained, but a force to be respected, to be understood, to be integrated. Ioan, Kaelin, and Lyra returned to Ioan's town, a town that was slowly recovering from the unnatural winter, a town that was different. The fear, the suspicion, the isolation that had characterized the community before were replaced by a sense of unity, of hope, of resilience. They had faced the darkness together, and they had emerged stronger. Ioan, no longer the timid bookstore owner, embraced her Frostborn heritage, her newfound powers, her destiny. She became a teacher, a guide, a protector, sharing her knowledge, her wisdom, her compassion, with those who sought to understand the magic that flowed through their veins. Kaelin, finally free from the burden he had carried for centuries, found peace, found love, found a home. He remained by Ioan's side, his loyalty unwavering, his love a constant, reassuring presence in her life. The wolf was still a part of him, closer to the surface now, but it was no longer a threat, a danger, but a source of strength, of connection, of wildness. He learned to balance his power, using the time to rebuild and explore a happiness he'd forgotten existed. Lyra, redeemed and forgiven, dedicated her life to healing the wounds she had inflicted, to helping others find their way back to the light. She became a healer, a counselor, a friend, using her knowledge of both the summer court and the Shadow Blight to guide those who had lost their way. The three of them, bound together by shared experience, by shared loss, by shared love, created a new community, a place where those who were different, those who carried the magic within them, could find acceptance, could find belonging, could find home. Years passed. The seasons turned. The world continued its eternal cycle of birth, death, and renewal. But the legacy of the Frostborn, the legacy of Ioan, Kaelin, and Lyra, lived on, a testament to the power of courage, of sacrifice, of love. One crisp autumn evening, as Ioan and Kaelin stood hand in hand, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and gold, Ioan felt a familiar chill in the air, a subtle shift in the energy around them. She looked at Kaelin, her eyes filled with a mixture of anticipation and peace. "Winter is coming," she said, her voice a soft, knowing murmur. Kaelin smiled, his silver eyes meeting hers, reflecting the warmth of the setting sun. "And we are ready," he said. The first snowflakes began to fall, delicate and gentle, a promise of the beauty, the magic, the balance that was to come. And Ioan, the Frostborn, the woman who had embraced her destiny, who had found love in the heart of the storm, knew that they were, indeed, ready. Ready for winter, ready for whatever the future held, ready to face it together. They knew, standing there under the falling snow, that the journey would always continue, but together. They were no longer alone. They were connected, by ice and by blood, by love and by purpose. The end.